Welcome, friends, to episode 324 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week, we sit down for a creative conversation with author Ted Chiang. Ted Chiang is the winner of 4 Nebula Awards, 4 Hugo Awards, and 6 Locus Awards. He's also a frequent nonfiction contributor to The New Yorker, who has called him, quote, one of the most influential science fiction writers of his generation. His 1998 novella, Story of Your Life, was adapted into the 2016 film Arrival by Denis Villeneuve. And welcome to the show, Ted. We're very excited to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
It really is an honor, and for such an amazing story. We are both massive fans of Story of Your Life and also the adaptation, and that's what we do here. We like to talk about adaptations, and this one's fascinating from both perspectives, and I'm just so excited to learn more about how much you were involved and just how this story came to you in the first place.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about all those things.
So we originally covered Arrival in 2019, so it's been 5 years now. We were still early on in our journey. For those who might be listening for the first time, we cover book-to-film adaptations. We always start with the source material, do its due diligence, and give it a moment to shine before we move into the adaptation. So we actually did this over 2 episodes. We devoted an entire episode to the novella. Since then, we've done over 150. So we've done a lot of these things now, and I feel like Arrival stands out to me as one of the more thought-provoking, just fascinating adaptations and source, and just the conversation we had about it. We had Mark Neiman Ross on to help us talk about it, and it was just a really cool episode. So I'm really excited to revisit this, and I went back and rewatched and reread so that it would be fresh. It was very, very cool, and it holds up.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you, Ted, for writing the story in the first place, because it is so beautiful. It's stuck with me. Like Luke said, we've done hundreds of these at this point, and this one definitely shines, and that source material is just so rich. And so thank you. Huge fan of your work.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
So we like to start off by asking people about favorites, but I read somewhere that you don't like picking favorites. So maybe a better way to say, are there any standout adaptations that you can think of that you think worked well, whether or not it's a favorite?
So one movie adaptation that I always like talking about is L.A. Confidential, based on the James Ellroy novel. So I think the movie came out in '94. So I saw the movie first. I was a big fan of the movie. And afterwards, I read a few James Ellroy novels. The novel L.A. Confidential is sort of third in a quartet. When I read the novel, I was really impressed by the film adaptation process what I imagined the process might have been like. Because the movie actually has relatively little in common with the novel. And, I like the movie a lot. I think it works very well. And so I was just really curious as to how did someone come up with the idea for this movie, given what the novel looks like? I don't know if you remember the movie, but the movie has a fairly complicated plot of uncovering this conspiracy with police corruption. It requires paying some attention, but the movie plot is trivially simple compared to the novel's plot. The novel's plot is, this labyrinthine, conspiracy involving all sorts of things, including a kind of a Walt Disney stand-in. Yeah, there's so much going on in the conspiracy in the novel. I would have thought that someone would look at this novel and say, there's no way we could adapt this. There's, how could we possibly, cram even a little bit of what's in this novel into a movie? But it seems like what they did was they said, we like these characters and we like this setting. So they basically wrote their own story using the characters from the novel, and they borrow some scenes that they like, and they borrow, just a couple elements, but they basically construct their own plot. At a certain level, it is, faithful to the spirit of the novel. But I think it is radically unfaithful to the letter of the novel. And so, I always think of it as a really interesting example of adaptation because, it's not something that I would ever have thought of as, how an adaptation could work. It's we like these characters and this setting, and so we're just going to kind of create our own storyline that, has some of the same feel as the story, but is almost entirely different. I recommend that as, I guess I find it kind of a fascinating example of how adaptation can work.
I love that. That's we just talked about on a recent episode that was one that we need to get to. We haven't gotten to yet. James has actually never seen the movie, whereas I have a few times. So I'm excited. He's been holding off because we know it's one we want to cover.
We tend to do that for the podcast. It's the double-edged sword of doing this is that sometimes it's more fun. I would have seen the film by now, but sometimes it's more fun for the viewers if we haven't, and it's that fresh look.
Yeah, but you bring up like a really interesting thing that we encounter all the time in adaptation, and that's where a new artist comes in as the filmmaker, and whether that's the screenwriter or director or a combination of both, and they decide to reimagine things, and they decide what they're going to keep and what they're not going to keep, and the resulting adaptation is often, it can sometimes be quite unrecognizable, and sometimes that's really good. I think Elliott Confidential, that's an example of where it really worked, and other times that's where you get some of the worst adaptations, right, where the changes are bad and they omit, really important scenes that are essential, and it's really fascinating, endlessly fascinating. So that's one of the reasons we like doing the podcast, is just talking about the process and seeing the result. Because, always interesting.
And, I bring it up because I really like LA Confidential as a movie. My understanding is that James Ellroy does not. I think he didn't say much for a long time, and then more recently he said that actually he was unhappy with it. So, there is that. I think it works really well. I think that, like I said, it's faithful to the spirit, if not the letter.
That is something that I've realized personally through these adaptations that we've experienced. There are times that is the most essential element, is that spirit of like, whether the plot is the same, whether the character is the same, these beats can be different, but that staying true to the spirit, more oftentimes than not, sometimes it doesn't work, but more often than not, it does at least make for an interesting adaptation. Because I like to see someone take a swing and maybe miss, versus someone playing it really safe and to the letter of the film, but not have that sort of inspiration or that spark that makes it special.
And I think that leads us into talking about Story of Your Life, because this is an example, in our opinion, of an excellent adaptation, but it does make changes. I would argue that, to me, it feels like it stays close to the spirit of your story, but I would be happy to hear your thoughts on that. But before we even get into the adaptation, I do want to focus on the story. We like to really give the story its due before we even, because that came first, right? I read that you wrote this story in 1998, and the film doesn't come out till 2015. So this thing has been around for a while and made its rounds and should be considered as its own piece of art. So I'd love to hear what the story seed was for this, and how you developed that into what it became.
I guess the original seed of the story is sort of two parts. The first was that I was always interested in this aspect of physics, the principle of least action, which is an example of a class of physical principles known as variational principles. So, this is a sort of a different way of understanding physics than the ones that we usually get in high school. And I always thought, it'd be cool if I could write about them, but I really had no idea how I could possibly use those in a story. Then one day I saw this one-man show. It was called Time Flies When You're Alive by the actor Paul Link. And when I was watching that show, I suddenly had this flash of inspiration of how I might be able to use these variational principles of physics as a way of telling a story about the inevitability of loss. What I wanted was, I only had the very vaguest idea at the beginning. It was like, I want to tell a story about a character who knows the future, but cannot change the future. And so there is great loss in their future, but also great joy. That was basically what I had at the beginning. And so then I had to figure out a bunch of things. One of them was, okay, what is the nature of this great loss and great joy that they can see in their future. I was thinking like, well, is it that, you're going to get married to someone you love and then eventually get divorced? That seemed like a possibility. But I thought like, I don't know, maybe not intense enough. And then I was thinking, oh, okay, maybe you marry someone and then they die. That sort of ups the intensity. But again, I was thinking like, maybe not enough. And then so I was thinking, well, okay, maybe you have a child and you know that the child is going to die. And then I thought like, okay, I think that's maximal intensity.
Yeah.
That's maximum joy and maximum pain. So I thought, okay, yeah, my story will be about a character who knows that they will have a child and then they will live to see that child die. So then I had, that part nailed down. And then the other big question was like, okay, how does my character gain knowledge of the future? Again, I tossed around a couple of possibilities. One was maybe does this character like take some weird mind-altering drug, which grants them knowledge of the future? I thought, I don't know. That didn't seem super interesting to me. I didn't feel like I could really, sink my teeth into that. And it's like another possibility. Does my character study, meditation and gain knowledge of the future that way? And that also didn't seem super interesting to me. Then I thought, well, okay, how about if the character learns a new language and learning that language grants them knowledge of the future? And that seemed like something I could really sink my teeth into. Because the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that language shapes how you think, that is a classic idea in science fiction. And it's one that, I find endlessly fascinating. So I thought, okay, that is definitely something I could work with. And then the follow-up was, okay, so what kind of language is this? Does my protagonist, have they encountered, say, a previously undiscovered tribe in, say, the depths of the Amazon who speak this language? It's like, well, that's a possibility. It's like, have they deciphered a previously unknown ancient, language from a bunch of tablets? It was also a possibility. But, it seemed like this language is going to be really, really weird. It's like the other possibility is that, okay, it's an alien language. And, that made the most sense, I guess, in terms of just how weird this language would have to be. And so that meant, okay, so now it's a first contact story, and my protagonist is a linguist who is being called on to help with the first contact communication. That, sort of set the major building blocks of the story in place, and so then I could proceed.
It's amazing. And I can see when you get to this point and you're ready to write, you at this point already in your career had developed this reputation as a hard sci-fi writer. And I imagine there's a sense of pressure that, like, if you write a story, there's going to be scrutiny, right, from your fans who are going to be like, I don't know, hard sci-fi is such an interesting genre where it's like we're the fans, and I consider myself one as well of the genre. Like, we're willing to say, okay, you can sort of stretch certain areas, you can introduce a new concept that maybe goes a little bit beyond what we understand, but then everything else has to like play by the rules. And so you're coming up with this fictional language that changes a perception of time, and yet I think you hold yourself to a certain truthfulness. Like it needs to pass the smell test as to like plausibility. And so I imagine that's where research comes in, and you have to like make sure that you're reading about linguistics. And I don't know if you have a background already in linguistics or what, but how did the research go for this? And was that something that is that something that you find that you have to spend a lot of time on for all your stories?
I don't have a background in linguistics. I have a certain interest in linguistics. I took a class on it in college, but it actually did not prepare me at all for this. I knew that, you're trying to write a story from the point of view of a linguist, that was going to be tough. But also, based on, what I could see about how this story was going to be built, I was also very conscious of the fact that this was a very ambitious story. It would be very difficult to write. And I was not at all confident that I could do it. I did not think I was really up to the task. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to actively work on this story. I'm going to just sort of put it on the back burner and keep thinking about it. And hopefully I will become good enough to write it. And in the meantime, I'll just read some books on linguistics. And so that's what I did for about 5 years.
Wow.
So after about 5 years of reading books on many different aspects of linguistics, I would be making notes like, ooh, okay, this is something I could use, or like, ooh, this is something that might be handy. But yeah, after about 5 years of that, I sort of came to think like, well, all right, I'm never going to be a linguist, so maybe I should actually try writing this story now. I'd reached a point where I felt like I knew enough to fake it. And, of course, I also have to make explicit, I certainly don't believe that learning any language would grant a person knowledge of the future.
Shoot.
Yeah.
It's too bad.
Yeah. And I know that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, there's sort of a strong form and a weak form, and linguists really are kind of tired of it because people are always going on about sort of the strong form of it. And I recognize that. Yeah, the story is arguing for like the strongest possible form of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which does not actually hold. If you grant that, if you're willing to put aside, if you're willing to suspend disbelief about that, then the rest of it, I was like, okay, yeah, I should try and make this character sound like they're a linguist. A linguist is very familiar with a lot of things about language, which most of us are not. So yeah, that is something which I think requires a fair amount of research if you're going to try and persuade anyone of that.
I just want to say, based on your work, you could have fooled me. You could have told me that you had an extensive background in linguistics, and 5 years of regular research, I think gives you a sort of background in linguistics. And I think it's so cool to hear that you're passionate about something, and that writing gives you that excuse to really do your due diligence and learn more about these subjects. So I think as creatives, we are so curious, and so I just love hearing that's very inspirational for me to hear that like you can kind of have it all in a sense. Like you can be interested in these subjects even though you're not a linguist. You do get to kind of live in the shoes of a linguist through this process.
But yeah, I want to make it clear, I'm not a linguist. I don't know, even a fraction of what an actual linguist knows. But I suppose it is the nature of writing fiction that you are often writing characters who have competencies that you yourself do not possess.
Right. Yeah, and it's a challenge, right? Unlocked a memory for me. I had forgotten this until you were talking. I went and saw Arrival for the first time with a friend of mine who has a degree in linguistics. And I remember us talking about that hypothesis afterwards. And that was like one of his things. He was like, oh, it's a really strict interpretation of it. And I didn't really know what he was talking about because I do not have that background, but that's so funny. But, for the record, he did really love the movie. It was just like, he had to talk about like how like this is a certain interpretation of a hypothesis. And that's so fascinating to hear. So when I first met you, it was, I think around 2019, you had come for it was a reading series that SIFWA put on, and they had one in Portland. So you came and you gave this presentation, and it was all about like free will, determinism, time travel. You talked about how prophecy is information traveling through time. A really fascinating talk that I thought really tied into a lot of the themes that I saw in your work for this story in particular and in Arrival. And I want to know, like, how did you determine that you wanted to tie? I mean, you said you wanted someone who can perceive time, but like how that time travel of information was going to work, and the idea that someone wouldn't be able to change their fate, because that goes against most time travel stories I feel like we see, where people want to change their fate. They want to change their future. And you've created a scenario where the reader is going to wish that the person could, right? We're all going to be like hoping, she can save her future daughter's life. But in your story, she can't. And yet it still feels hopeful for me, which is such a balancing act, even though the subject matter is so dark and sort of sad. How did you approach like linking those things, like the philosophy, the science with the linguistics?
For me, the idea that if a character knows the future, I think implicit in that is the idea that you can't change the future. Because if you can change the future, then what you knew, that wasn't the future. That was just a possible future. We all know possible futures. Anyone can make up a possible future. Knowing a possible future is almost nothing. Either you know the actual future, or you're just like the rest of us. Of course, there is this very common story trope where you're granted knowledge of the future, like how things will go if all events proceed on their current path, whatever that means. That's sort of a narrative convenience, but from a logical perspective, I don't think that it's really coherent, because that idea sort of grants the protagonist agency. The protagonist is in a position of making choices, but no one else is. No one else in the world apparently can make a choice. And it's like, that does not make sense. Either we are all making choices or none of us are. The universe does not revolve around any one person. So if we are all making choices, then again, the idea that you're granted knowledge of the future that will occur unless you yourself make a decision, that doesn't make any sense either. So to say that someone gets knowledge of the future necessarily implies that you can't change it, that it is the future, not just a possible future. There's nothing you can do to avert it. It makes for difficult storytelling, but I think that it is logically consistent in a way that the other version, where it's like, oh, this is how things will turn out if everything proceeds on its path. That version, like I said, it's narratively convenient, but I don't think it is logically consistent. If your goal is logical consistency, then it's kind of an all or nothing thing. These are questions which I find, I guess, endlessly fascinating, and these are questions which I kind of return to. They form a theme which runs through a number of my stories.
Do you think we have free will? I know it's a big question, but or do you believe that it is more in line with the story of your life, and that there is a sort of a set fate, and yet and maybe free will is maybe not even the right question to ask?
It all depends on what you mean by the phrase free will. In brief, I would say I believe in what is known as compatibilist free will. So compatibilism is this school of thought in philosophy which says that not only is free will compatible with determinism, free will actually requires determinism. The most meaningful definition of free will, the version of free will that if you actually think about it and try and figure out what it is that you want when you say you want to have free will, if you try and work that out, that is something that only can exist in a deterministic universe. Because what some people think they want from free will is a scenario where it's like, okay, if I choose option A or I choose option B, there's a universe in which I choose option A, and that universe is identical to the universe in which I choose option B up until the very moment that I make the choice. That decision point is where the two branch off. In that scenario, if the universe is the same in both option A and option B up until the moment you make your decision, what was your decision actually based on? Because your decision could not have been based on anything that ever happened to you, because that was the same in both. It could not be based on any book you ever read, anything you ever witnessed, any thought you ever had, because the premise of this is that those are identical up until the moment that you make your decision. In which case, your decision is pretty much just a random coin flip. So this sort of naive version of free will actually doesn't give you what I think most people want from free will. What you want from free will is for your decision to have been based on your life experiences, the things you read, the things you've seen, the thoughts you've had. You want all of your life experience to feed into the choices you make. You want your choice to be a product of your lived experience. And the way that happens is through determinism. Determinism is how your experiences affect your decisions. You are a sort of ongoing computation, and the inputs of that computation are your entire life, and the output of this computation is your actions, your decisions. And so it's an extremely complicated computation, and it is not one that anyone can easily predict, because no one else has complete access to all the inputs that go into this computation. No one else has all the data. No one else knows everything that you've read and seen and thought. But that is where your decisions come from. And how can this computation work? It works because there is determinism. Because causes have effects. Because the things in your life have consequences on you. And so this is, I'd say, the more meaningful definition of free will. This is what we want when we say we want free will. And you get that through determinism.
I love that. Yeah, I that you put it into words in a way that I would not have been able to, but I totally agree. I took a philosophy class in college, and I remember our discussions of free will versus determinism and trying to, sort of find a way that both could work. And yeah, I always felt more in line with determinism as a thought, even though it feels claustrophobic. The idea that everything you do is the thing you always were going to do can sometimes feel a little depressing to me. It's like you're trapped in it. But that's one of the reasons I love your story is it proposes the alternate view of like you can find a way to embrace that. Because as it says in the story, if you have access to the story of your life and you can see everything you're going to do, how do you go about living that out? But Luis finds a way to embrace sort of the performance of it. I don't know. It's such a fascinating concept that I still feel like I'm wrapping my head around.
In reality, we don't have knowledge of our future. So right. Luis is in a different position than we are. None of us have knowledge of our future. Once you get knowledge of the future, then things get weird. And that is an interesting philosophical question. But in reality, it simply doesn't obtain. None of us have knowledge of the future, so we don't have to wrestle with the specific question, the specific issues that
raises the paradoxes of time travel, right?
Yeah. Yes.
I think it's interesting too because often determinism can be linked to religion or like deities as well. But I love the way that your determinism is experiential. Like it's the compounding effect of everything that goes on in our lives and every thought that we've had, like you said, like that is in a sense free will and determinism, but free will because all of the things that we've done up to that point have formed us, and then that determinism of you were always going to do that based on your past experiences. It's putting it that eloquently, like that's going to make me rethink some things when I'm reading stories that engage with this philosophy.
Yeah, because like you're talking about like intelligent design. I think people often will bring up with determinism, but really they are kind of two separate concepts because there's nothing that says that some sort of higher power laid out the path. It's more just the path that is before us.
Yeah, this has nothing to do with any sort of deity, and certainly has nothing to do with intelligent design. This is based on the idea of a purely mechanistic universe. And yeah, I'm an atheist, and I think religion is actually more commonly associated with these notions of free will, which rely on an immaterial soul. But yeah, if you don't believe in an immaterial soul, your choices are either compatibilism or some alternate physics which maybe posits some other mechanism, some kind of naturalistic but maybe non-physical mechanism by which free will can be enacted.
So I want to move on into the adaptation here soon, but I just have one other question about this because I have been on a couple panels at different cons about research, and it's like research with writing, like how much research is too much? How, when do you know when to stop? And I feel like the question always comes up about like, you don't want to get too bogged down. You don't want to never finish the story. There's a point where you're sort of being self-indulgent and you're just kind of learning and you're never actually writing the story. And of course, all of that is true to an extent, but it feels to me like you're someone who goes against that a little bit. Like if you can spend 5 years working on this story, you have a different attitude towards research in its relation to your work. Just thoughts on that? Like, should writers be embracing that aspect of it?
It is definitely true that research can be a form of writing avoidance. I would say that for me, I do as much research as I feel I need in order to clearly envision scenes. If I have no idea what, for example, a linguist does, or I have only the vaguest idea of what a linguist does, then, how could I possibly write a scene in which a linguist is making decisions, is responding to questions. There's no simple and clear answer to like how much research is enough research. But for me, it's like how much research allows me to figure out what does this scene look like? How would, such a character behave? What would they say? What would they do? That I think is, I guess, my sort of guideline. And, there is obviously this temptation where it's like, oh, I've learned this really cool thing and I'm going to have my character say it just because it's so cool. It's like, yeah, that's probably not beneficial to the story. Yeah, you don't need to have your character say things that are, even if they're super cool, it's like, what does the story need? What do you need in order to finish this scene? That's, for me, that's, I guess, sort of my guideline.
Is this a scenario where you will begin to write a story, realize you get to a point where you'd like to do some more research, go away from it, do the research, come back and continue writing? Or do you tend to do a lot of research and then knock out the story all in a fairly shorter period of time than the 5 years that it took you to do the research?
I would say that I probably do more of my research ahead of time because, it's hard for me to even figure out what are the scenes going to be until I have, some sense of what this character's job looks like.
So we will return to our conversation with Ted momentarily, but we did just want to take a moment and talk about a promotion we are running over on Patreon. So we have these new stickers that we just got made. It is really cool art. I mean, you'll have to see our pictures we put up on social media and stuff. I can't show it to you over the podcast, but I love the way they turned out, and we are going to be sending those out to our existing patrons. Whoever, if you're at the level where you get the stickers, we're going to go ahead and send it to you. So you are doing the thing that you need to do. But we're doing a promotion because we have recently got below our monthly income that we needed to pay for the podcast. So we're getting to the point where this could become unsustainable. And we don't want to get there. We want to make sure that we can continue to keep doing this thing. So we're asking for people to sign up, and our promotion is usually you would have to maintain the sticker level for 3 months before we would send it to you. But for this month, we're going to do it after just one. So if you sign up for it, we will send this thing to you. It would be also a great help for us and help us keep this podcast going.
Outside of stickers, just so you know that we have the Patreon also for our bonus episodes where we do adaptation adjacent stuff, all kinds. So you're getting extra episodes as well. So it's extra episodes, stickers. There's also tiers for mugs and T-shirts and hoodies, that kind of stuff. So. Check all that out. And, it's the best way to support the podcast, and we super appreciate it.
And the link for that will be in the show notes below. It's patreon.com/inktofilm. Another way you can support the podcast is we have a bookshop link down there, and we will have copies of Ted Chiang's 2 collections. Both of those available through our bookshop. So after listening to him talk, if you want to pick up those collections, using those links would help us out.
All right. So as you started to get rumblings that there was a possible adaptation of your work, were you excited? Were you a bit anxious about someone adapting your work, or did you find yourself feeling like you wanted to still have a hand on the wheel? Where did the adaptation process take you?
Well, I have no idea what it means to hear there are rumblings about an adaptation. I don't know what that means.
Sure. Does your agent, I guess, come to you and say, "Hey, we've got some interest"?
So, for this example, for Story of Your Life, this came out of the blue. I got email from a couple producers. They said the screenwriter has brought your story to our attention. The story came out in '98, and I think they first got in touch with me in either 2010 or 2011. And, my first reaction was, are you sure you've got the right story? Because this story, I think, is unfilmable. And they said, no, we're sure. This is the story. Yeah, it was not something that had ever occurred to me. And I think that many people, when they read the story, they think, yeah, this is unfilmable. There'd be no way you could make this into a movie.
And was this Eric Heisserer who had the screenplay?
So what I later found out is Eric, he tells this story that he'd gotten a few of his screenplays produced. Then he did what they call the bottled water tour. He gets meetings with studios and producers, and they give him a bottle of water, and they say, okay, so is there any project that you have in mind? And he would tell them, well, there's this story I'd like to adapt. There's no franchise potential. It has a female protagonist. It's a very intellectual story. And then he says, they would say, give us back that bottle of water and get the hell out of here. Yeah, so he had read the story and he had this idea of how to adapt it. But when he pitched it to people were unreceptive. And then eventually he found a couple producers who read the story and decided, like, yeah, they thought they wanted to give it a shot.
So you had to sort of give your okay to Eric to shop this around at this point where he's asking these producers. He came to you first to get your okay on it?
No, he did not.
Okay.
Because all he's doing is pitching. Any writer can, pitch something. The producer, like I suppose anyone listening to a pitch will then say, like, okay, are the rights available? Because if the rights aren't available, then there's no point in going on. If they find out that the rights are available, then the question is, okay, can we secure the rights? So these two producers, they contacted me and they said, we'd like to give this a shot. However, we have no money at all.
Great.
So they said, we cannot option the story. What we are requesting is a shopping agreement. A shopping agreement is a no money, no commitment deal. Basically, you grant them permission to develop their movie for, say, some period of time, like a year. And basically all you're saying is, like, I won't let anyone else, I'm not going to sell it to anyone else in this time. But at the end of this period, I'm free to walk away because no money has changed hands. So they were asking for a shopping agreement, and they said, our screenwriter, Eric Heisserer, he's willing to write a screenplay on spec. He had already had screenplays made into movies, so he doesn't have to write anything on spec if he doesn't want to. But he was willing to spend, like a year working on a screenplay for no money up front. And so that spoke to his commitment, his enthusiasm for the project. It's very rare, I think, to have a screenwriter who has had work produced for a screenwriter in that position to say, like, yeah, I will work on it. I'll work on a screenplay for a year for no money. So, so that said something. We got on the phone, Eric and I, and he pitched me his vision for the movie. And like I said, before, I thought, like, this movie is unfilmable. But during the phone call, he laid out the movie that he had in mind. And, listening to him, I was like, yeah, I could see that. I could see that as a movie. So I said, okay, go ahead, take your best swing. So then, so he wrote a screenplay. Then they took the screenplay around, and there were no takers. I don't know if you guys have talked about the blacklist on this podcast.
We have not.
But so the blacklist was this thing that sort of started up. They put together a list of the unproduced screenplays. It was a sort of a survey. They would conduct a survey of people who, like producers and various people who are reading scripts in Hollywood, and say, like, what was the best unproduced screenplay you read this year? And then they'd add up the totals. And that became known as the blacklist. And so every year they would release, like, okay, here are the 10 most highly praised unproduced screenplays this year. Eric's screenplay for Arrival, it was still called Story of Your Life back then. Eric's screenplay for A Story of Your Life made the blacklist, and so people were talking about it. But the blacklist is for things that everyone has passed on. Sometimes screenplays that are on the blacklist, people take a second look at them, and it might generate enough buzz that someone will actually decide to finance it. But that did not happen. People still were not willing to put up any money because for all those things, like, as Eric said, like, no franchise potential, female protagonist, really intellectual. So even then, no one was willing to back the project.
So with that screenplay, do you mind telling us, like, how similar was that pitch that he gave to you over the phone to what we finally got as the adaptation? And also, how long did it remain on that blacklist?
Well, I mean, the blacklist, they do that every year. I'd have to check what year it made the blacklist. I'm going to say 2013. I'd say there are strong similarities between the final product and what Eric initially envisioned. As is always the case, the scripts go through multiple revisions. The thing that I'd say sets apart Story of Your Life's development process from that of most movies is that by the time they found financing, and then, so then it was time to actually, draw up contracts, and so they actually optioned the story for me. By the time that happened, Eric, he was not just the screenwriter, he was also a producer. He had it written into his contract that if there were going to be rewrites, he would be the one to rewrite them. So he is the only person who has worked on that screenplay, which is virtually unheard of in Hollywood. Eric has said that there are only 2 films for which he was the sole writer. It was this one and another movie that he directed himself. Every other screenplay, ones that he has sole screenwriting credit on, were rewritten multiple times after he left. So the fact that this movie turned out the way it did, the fact that the final product is as close to the early conception of it as it is, a lot of that is due to the fact that Eric was the only person doing the rewriting.
And I've heard Eric Heisserer say that he worked very closely with Denis Villeneuve, would call him about things on the day. Hey, we're doing this. Hey, this is that. Explain to me what your intentions were with the screenplay at this part. What was your reaction to finding out that Denis Villeneuve would be the director who was attached to the film eventually?
So it's funny. So when those 2 producers first contacted me, when they had no money at all, but they said, like, we have this director that we think would be good for this. It's this guy named Denis Villeneuve. They sent me a movie of his, and so at that point, Denis had never directed a film in English. So they sent me a DVD of this French language film of his called Incendies. And when I watched that, I was like, this is an interesting choice. It was not at all an obvious choice for a science fiction film. So they had Denis Villeneuve in mind at the early on, when essentially no one knew who he was. Years later, after the project had actually gotten somewhere, then they re-entered negotiations with Denis. At the time that they were negotiating with him, he had 2 English language films that were just about to come out. The first one was Enemy with Jake Gyllenhaal, and the second one was Prisoners with Hugh Jackman and Jake Gyllenhaal. So at that point, he was developing a lot of buzz. At that point, it was then it became sort of a big get, and so they got him on board. But so that what happened next was that I guess the first actor that he talked to, he wanted Amy Adams to play Louise. He contacted Amy Adams, and Amy Adams read the script, and she said, yeah, she wanted to do it. So she was on board, and so that was a huge get.
Yeah.
But then the problem was that Amy Adams would not be available for the next calendar year because she would be filming Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice.
Oh, wow.
So then it was like, okay, so Denis Villeneuve, he can't wait around for a year. So he went off to direct another movie, which turned out to be Sicario. For that year, we were just sort of like, okay, so Amy Adams is doing one movie, Denis Villeneuve is doing another movie. We just have to hope that their schedules will line up again when they're done with these projects. Because, that is not at all guaranteed. The fact that they have both signed on to this, that doesn't mean anything. It could still, just sort of remain something that they want to do but never get around to actually doing. There was some real uncertainty for that year. But then, eventually, they both finished their projects and schedules lined up. And so it's like, okay, now things are actually going to move forward.
It's amazing.
So
amazing stuff.
Once they actually start making this thing, like filming is happening, it's in production, do you hear anything? Are you getting updates, or are you just sort of on the sidelines while your work's being made into this big movie?
So I was not actively involved. Eric sent me, a couple drafts along the way. It was clear to me that Eric is fielding rewrite requests and notes from many directions, and I don't think that I'm going to help the process by trying to get actively involved. So I sent him some notes for the drafts that he sent me, but I was perfectly okay with the fact that he's got bigger fish to fry. He's trying to get this movie made. I left it to him because I trusted his vision. He was the one who saw how this unfilmable story could be filmed, and so it didn't seem like I was going to help
Right.
So I wasn't actively involved. I did get a set visit at one
Oh, you
point.
did?
Yes, I got to visit the set. They were shooting in Montreal. They had this set built in sort of a warehouse on the outskirts of Montreal. They had two sets built. These were sets for the kind of the tunnel or the passage into the alien spaceship. So they had one outside that was oriented vertically, and then they had one inside which was oriented horizontally. I got to watch filming for a couple days, and yeah, I got to look at the set for the room with the white sort of screen, and so all of that was super cool.
Did you get to hang out in Video Village? Did you get to see the action as it's going on, like Denis and all the, you get to maybe interact with some of the actors?
I was introduced to Amy Adams and to Jeremy Renner, but I didn't really have much interaction with them. I guess I found it fascinating, but I guess one of the things that's really struck me about the movie making process is just how much waiting around there is.
It's a bit slow and boring at times, huh?
Because like they would spend 40 minutes adjusting the lighting for a shot. The actors would come out of their trailers, they'd say a line, and then they'd go back into their trailers, and then they would spend another 40 minutes adjusting the lights. The actor would come out again and say a line, and then go back. And actually, sometimes it wasn't even a line. The first day I was on set, I'm not sure that I'm not sure if I actually heard any line of dialogue spoken. And the second day, I think there were a couple lines which I heard.
That had to have been a surreal experience. I just being there and seeing them, because it's such a big production, making the thing that you thought up, right? Like going all the way back to that story seed, that led to this idea, and now it's this big production, which leads me to the next question. Like, what was it like when you first saw the final product? And was that like in a theater when it came out, or did you get an advanced screen of it?
It was in a theater. I didn't get an advanced screening. It was actually funny. At one point, the studio sent someone up to Seattle to interview me for the bonus materials on the Blu-ray. And they sent like a list of questions, and I had to email back saying like, I have not seen the movie. I cannot answer these questions. I can only answer these other ones. So the people shooting the bonus material, they had seen the movie, but I had not seen the movie. Mm-hmm. The movie premiered. I think it first might have was shown at the Venice Film Festival, and then it was showing at a couple film festivals in the U.S. I think it was showing at Telluride and Toronto, and I was like, I would like to see this movie.
Yeah, I bet.
So I flew myself out to Toronto, to the Toronto Film Festival, and I got to see it there. And so, watching the movie, I wasn't so much comparing it to my story as I was comparing it to, the last draft of the screenplay I had read. I was surprised. There were some differences between the last screenplay I had read and the film. Those surprised me because I had this sort of naive idea that it would be the screenplay put on screen. I might have gotten that impression because you'll see published versions of screenplays for movies. I had read published versions of screenplays. I guess, one thing that I didn't realize is that whenever they publish a version of a screenplay, that is reverse engineered to the final cut. That's not the script that they used when they were shooting. That's the script that they are publishing to remind you of the movie you saw. The shooting script was probably very different. Yeah, sometimes online you can find earlier drafts, and it's like, oh, well, look, there's a scene in Pulp Fiction where this happened. It's like, oh, well, that was the shooting script, and that wasn't the final product. And I've since heard, I guess there's an expression that a movie is written 3 times. The first time when the screenplay is written, the second time when it's directed, and the third time when it's edited. So a movie continues to evolve throughout the production process.
How did you feel they tackled sort of the core concepts, the time travel, of information, the core question of free will and determinism and all of that is sort of at the heart of your story? Do you think that was accurately or faithfully adapted into the story, even as a lot of the other elements were changed?
like I said, I'm very happy with how the movie turned out. I think it is both a good movie in its own right and a good adaptation. And I think, it is faithful to the spirit of the story, which is, I think, more important than being faithful to the letter of the original. Actually, I kind of think that if it were more faithful to the letter of my original story, it probably would not work as well as a film.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's interesting because your story is written in the medium of language, right? And that's what the whole story is about. It's about language. Like even your use of this like future past tense is like a playful way of saying like, I will remember when you do this. And like you're playing already with language in a way that reflects a lot of the core, I don't know, thematic and just the material of the story itself. When all of a sudden now that's going into a film, it's such a challenge because now you've changed mediums and now you're doing a visual medium and you're no longer playing in that space of language. Of course, there are spoken words in the movie, but that seemed like such a huge challenge for me that I would have agreed that like, how do you do that in a way that is going to do justice to the story? That's one of the things I love most about this movie is I think it was a brilliant challenge and one that Eric Heisserer should get tons of credit and Denis Villeneuve to being able to actually do this with a story that to me seems like it's almost more at home in the written word.
I would have said this was unfilmable. Most of the action is taking place inside the protagonist's head. Eric deserves so much credit for seeing a way to make it a visual story. I really don't know if anyone else would have ever thought of that. It just seems like such an unlikely candidate for adaptation.
From the beginning of the film, he shows an understanding and some combination of Eric and Denis Villeneuve show an understanding of like the language of film and the way that it progresses and how the story is so inherently about time travel in a sense in the way that we perceive it and how we typically perceive film and the language of film is how we as an audience are going into to watch this film. And then I love the way that like right away they're showing us things in a very similar way to how it affects, I think, the audience in your story. They're able to show something and have that be nonlinear without the audience realizing that. And then that sort of setting the groundwork for then the reveals that are eventually coming and like the way that the language is affecting perception and just I love the look at craft in that way, and it's so intentional. It's not just it's not your typical first contact story. Even if it is interesting to note in this film, there are elements that become a little more familiar as far as a first contact story are concerned with like the looming threat and the way that the public is reacting. That's something that was added into the film, and I'm just curious your thoughts on that and like this additional layer of like the public and the kind of ticking time clock of governments at play.
Well, those are things which you need if you were going to try and get people into a theater. Yeah, I don't know that you could get people to watch a movie if it didn't have something like that. A film that is, like I said, that is really faithful to the letter of the original. Yeah, I don't know how well that would work compared to all the ways that, as you say, that the movie does sort of illustrate its themes. The structure of the film and how that reinforces the message of the film. Those are so much more important than the changes that were made. There are these all these sort of thematic elements that run through the movie. The fact that the alien script is circular in the film, and it's not in my original story. That's not how the script is described in the story. But that was very deliberate on Eric's part. He had it in the script that the alien language be written in a circular form because that mimics the structure of the film itself, that it loops back on itself. Eric actually tells the story of when he was pitching the movie in the early days. One of the things that he does when he pitches a film is he brings some cards with him, like just like some photos as props, as visual indicators. And so he says that when he was pitching the story, as he was making his pitch, he would put these cards on the table to illustrate the sort of the arc of the story. And he would lay these cards out in a circle, and by the time he got to the end of the story, the cards would have formed a complete circle, mimicking the structure of the film. So that is all intentional. That degree of care and attention, those are ways in which the movie is really, really faithful to the spirit of the story, because those are an analog to the way that the language in the story is an attempt to convey some of the ideas in the story.
As someone who's so steeped in sci-fi as you are, I assume it's been a thrill for you to see Denis Villeneuve continue to operate in the space with things like Blade Runner 2049 and then into Dune. Outside looking in, what a dream person to adapt to your story, because looking at the landscape, I'm like, he's the person you would point to now if you wanted to get a sci-fi adaptation done. Is there anyone else that you, or any other stories of yours that you feel would work as an adaptation, or any filmmakers that you're like, oh, I really like this person and their vision?
I mean, okay, so if there's one thing that I take away from my experience with the Story of Your Life, is that I'm not the person to ask about what story would be a good candidate for adaptation, because I would never have thought that it could be filmed, and yet it was, and done so well. I'm probably the last person to ask about what story would make a good movie. I don't know.
Well, how about filmmakers? Are there any filmmakers who are making sci-fi right now? I mean, because Denis Villeneuve, like you said, he's one of the best, I think, doing it. In fact, I think they've announced he's going to do a Rendezvous with Rama. We read about, James. He's going to be doing that. So he's got more sci-fi on the way. Of course, finishing out with Dune Messiah, his trilogy of Dune films. But yeah, outside of that, is there any directors whose work you particularly enjoy that do sci-fi films?
Okay, so it's not a film, but I think that what Tony Gilroy did with Andor is pretty amazing.
Yeah, I love that show. Very cool.
Andor kind of blew me away, and Tony Gilroy, I guess we don't normally associate him with science fiction. We associate him with movies like Michael Clayton, and he's done great work, in sort of more mainstream film. So it was super interesting to see him take on science fiction and make something so interesting as Andor.
And to do it in Star Wars, which is such a saturated space too, and to do something unique and fresh there was, it was like you said, surprising, and it thrilled me.
Yeah, it's one of the only Star Wars things I've liked lately. So I like that one. I like that choice. A name that came to my mind that I'm just going to put out there, and he's not really known for doing a lot of sci-fi, but maybe adjacent, is Damon Lindelof, who did like The Leftovers and Lost and the new Watchmen. It was on HBO. He normally does more TV, but what I love about his work is the way that he engages with the sort of philosophical heart of the speculative thing that he's proposing, like in the Leftovers, the idea of like 2% of the population just disappearing, and it gets so philosophical. That's one of the things I love about your work is how you engage with the philosophy behind the science and behind the speculative element that you've brought into it. So I see a little bit of a parallel there to where I feel like maybe he would do a good job. I'll put that one out there.
Yeah. If he's listening.
Yeah. With your story, you were sort of stretching what was possible with these tenses. Because I had never read this future tense, this like, I will remember way you constructed a lot of these asides that it would go to, where we would get, we'd get sort of the present, quote unquote, with the speaking through the looking glass. And then we would get these parts that would come in and would talk about Louise and her daughter. and it was all these like future memories. And it was so fascinating because like I had seen the movie before I read your story, and so I kind of knew the conceit going in. But I kept thinking like if I hadn't seen the movie, what would I make of these parts? And I don't know. Like I wonder like if as a reader, do you know what the game is because of the way the language is being constructed, or you're just like this is an odd way to write this, huh? And then you just continue on. That had to have been so hard to write.
In some ways, there's a difference in what comes up front and what is held until later, because like you were saying that because you'd seen the movie before you read the story, you knew certain things, whereas if you read the story first and you then see the film, you know certain things. The movie really holds back on the death of Louise's daughter, whereas that's on the first page of the story.
Well, I guess it shows it to us, but we have no context. We assume it's happened in the past.
Yes. Yeah. Whereas, while it might not be immediately obvious from the first page, pretty quickly, I think the story makes it clear that these are things.
It's in the language, right?
Yes.
This is a future tense. This is something that will happen in the future.
I am curious, Sue, with Arrival maybe introduced your work to a wider audience, maybe an audience that doesn't typically engage with theoretical and hard science in their science fiction. Have you noticed a difference in your overall audience at this point and like the way that they're responding to your art?
Well, certainly the movie radically increased my audience, brought my work to many people that would never have read me before. My work was previously only read by people who read science fiction short stories, and now it's read by people who never read science fiction short stories. There's this reaction sometimes where people say like, your work really isn't science fiction, is it? And I'm like, no, my work is exactly science fiction.
Yeah.
You might think it's not because you don't read science fiction. It's not, it doesn't match the stereotype you have in your head of science fiction. But yeah, my work is, absolutely science fiction. And so, that's a reaction that I guess comes from people who, don't read science fiction. People who are regular readers of science fiction, they read my work and it's like, yes, I know exactly what this is. People who don't regularly read science fiction, they're like, is this science fiction? So, I guess that's maybe the difference in terms of the reactions I've gotten.
Well, it sounds to me like we are at a point where we can start wrapping this thing up. Thank you so much for coming on, Ted. I, according to what we've been discussing here, it seems to me that it was always fated that you were going to come on this show. And we are only now expressing that and sort of embracing our future. So thank you for making that a piece of the present.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been fun. I'm glad I was able to actualize this.
It's been an honor to talk to you, Ted. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Ted.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks, James.
So stick around for the very end. We're going to announce our next project. But if you enjoyed our conversation with Ted Chiang, let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. And if you are on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. We appreciate all the help we can get.
And also be sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of those adding to film. We're also on TikTok, Blue Sky. Wherever you can be on social media, we might also be there. So check it out.
Probably are. And if you'd like to support this podcast in another way, as we mentioned earlier in the episode, we do have a Patreon, patreon.com/inktofilm. That is the best way to monetarily support us, and we could really use your help right now.
So thank you once again to Ted for coming on. I mean, that was an incredible conversation. I love getting to talk to the people who we owe these adaptations to. So hearing all of his perspectives on a Story of Your Life and Arrival, one of our favorite projects, it was amazing.
It was amazing. So all that's left to do, though, is announce our next project, which is one that I have been excited about for some time. We are going to be getting into Junji Ito and the Uzumaki anime adaptation that has just started coming out. I've been holding off on reading this thing. I just know I love his work in general, and we thought nothing better than Junji Ito for Halloween and for October. That we thought that would be super appropriate.
I love Junji Ito, and he's someone that I've read a fair amount of, but like I mean, going back pretty far, I'm a big manga fan. I've been reading manga for quite some time. And so like getting to dive into someone like this, I mean, it's just, we talk about it with comics, but manga is like, it's a singular thing. And I can't wait to talk about Junji Ito, and Uzumaki is one of his most famous stories. So getting to see how they're doing this on Adult Swim too, like they're really trying to go for his style in this anime adaptation. So this will be a lot of fun, and honestly, right in my wheelhouse.
Yeah. Yeah, man, I can't wait. But until next time.
Keep adapting.